He thought his grandfather left him a legacy of dust and rust. The truth he found was worth more than any treasure. The digital rendering on the massive, wall-sized screen was a symphony of warm light and living green. Sunlight, rendered in perfect, hazy shafts, filtered through the leaves of mature oak trees, dappling the communal courtyards and wooden walkways of a building that felt more like a village than an apartment complex. It was beautiful. It was hopeful. It was everything Leo believed architecture was supposed to be. He stood before it, a lone figure in a suit that was just a little too tight in the shoulders, his back to the long, polished mahogany table where the gods of capital sat in judgment. His voice, earnest and passionate, echoed slightly in the cavernous, climate-controlled boardroom. And so, by prioritizing human-scale design and shared green spaces, we're not just building units, we're fostering a community. The Hemlock Project is more than a structure. It's a story about how we can live better, together. He clicked the remote, and the screen went dark. He turned, a hopeful, nervous smile on his face, his eyes scanning the impassive, tailored silhouettes seated before him. The silence that followed was a physical thing, cold, heavy, and absolute. It stretched for an eternity, broken only by the faint, sterile hum of the air conditioning. The faces that stared back at him were smooth, unreadable masks, their expressions reflecting nothing but the cold, blue-white glare of the recessed ceiling lights. Finally, the man at the head of the table, a silver-haired titan named Sterling, leaned forward. He didn't look at Leo. He looked at a spreadsheet on the tablet in front of him, his finger tracing a line of red numbers. When he spoke, his voice was not cruel, but something far worse, utterly, profoundly indifferent. The projected ROI on your community is 4.7% below our quarterly target. He looked up, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, finally meeting Leo's. Your sentiment is noted, son. But it's unprofitable. He tapped his tablet, dismissing the file. And then came the phrase that shattered the room, and Leo's world, into 1,000 tiny pieces. We build assets here, not artwork. A low, appreciative chuckle rippled down one side of the table. A rival architect, a man known for designing glass boxes that looked like spreadsheets brought to life, smirked and shook his head. Leo felt the blood drain from his face. The heat of 100 invisible stares pricked at his skin. He saw his peers, young architects like himself, scattered around the edges of the room. They weren't looking at him. They were suddenly fascinated by their shoes, by the grain of the wood on the walls, by anything other than the public execution they were all witnessing. The hopeful smile on Leo's face felt like it had been chiseled from stone. His dream, the culmination of 2 years of sleepless nights and relentless passion, had just been reduced to a rounding error. It wasn't a rejection, it was an erasure. He opened his mouth to say something, a defense, a plea, but no words came. His throat was a knot of shame and silent, impotent rage. Sterling had already moved on, his voice a low, decisive hum as he discussed Q4 projections with the man beside him. The meeting continued around Leo as if he had ceased to exist. He was a ghost in his own professional funeral. With hands that felt clumsy and disconnected from his body, he began gathering his presentation materials, the smooth, heavy paper now feeling like a stack of worthless, childish drawings. He fumbled, and a sheaf of papers slid from his grasp, scattering across the polished floor in a fan of white, each page a testament to his naivete. No one moved to help him. He knelt, the cheap fabric of his suit pulling tight across his knees, and gathered the pieces of his shattered vision, the sound of his own frantic, ragged breathing roaring in his ears. The air in the room was suffocating. He had to get out. The apartment door clicked shut, the sound a dull, hollow thud that offered no comfort, only confinement. The space was a perfect reflection of the boardroom he'd just fled, All clean lines, cold surfaces, and a complete absence of a human soul. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a breathtaking, impersonal cityscape of blue glass towers that scraped a bruised, twilight sky. It was the kind of view he was supposed to want, the kind of success he was supposed to be building. Tonight, it just felt like a cage. He loosened his tie, the knot suddenly a suffocating presence. The silence in the apartment was a roaring vacuum, rushing in to fill the space left by the boardroom's casual cruelty. Sterling's words echoed in the void, a relentless, percussive mantra. "We build assets, son, not artwork." The word, son, had been the final, casual twist of the knife, a paternalistic dismissal that had stripped him of his professional identity and left him feeling like a naive, scolded child. He walked through the sterile, showroom-perfect living room, his own footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished concrete floor. His world, his entire professional life, was contained in this one room. The walls were covered not with art, but with his own architectural sketches, meticulously pinned in neat, hopeful rows. Detailed, hand-drawn elevations of libraries that curved like open books, of schools that felt like treehouses, of homes that seemed to grow organically from the earth. And in the center, given pride of place, were the dozens of renderings for the Hemlock Project. His dream. His folly. He stood before them, his reflection a ghostly, distorted figure in the glass of a framed blueprint. He saw the slightly too tight suit, the tired, defeated slump of his shoulders, the hollowed-out look in his eyes. He had poured 2 years of his life, every ounce of his passion and his talent, into these drawings. And in the space of 30 seconds, a man with a spreadsheet had turned them all into monuments of his own failure. They were no longer blueprints for a better future, they were relics of a naive, foolish past. His phone buzzed on the granite countertop, its vibration a jarring, unwelcome intrusion. The screen lit up with a name that made his stomach clench: Dad. He stared at it, a fresh wave of shame washing over him. He could already hear the conversation, the weary, disappointed sigh. I told you, Leo. This art project nonsense doesn't pay the bills. There's a senior draftsman position open at Henderson Group. Stable. Benefits. It's time to be practical. Practical. It was the word his father had used his whole life, a verbal cudgel to beat back any of Leo's creative, unprofitable impulses. It was the word Sterling had used, in different clothes. He couldn't face it. Not tonight. He silenced the call, watching the screen go dark, plunging the room back into its cool, blue-gray twilight. He was a coward. He couldn't even face his own father's disappointment. He slumped onto a sleek, uncomfortable leather sofa that had looked good in a catalog but offered no real comfort. He was adrift in a sea of self-doubt, the shoreline of his own confidence having completely eroded away. Was his father right? Was Sterling right? Was his passion for creating beautiful, meaningful spaces just a form of arrested development? A childish, naive dream that had no place in the real, practical world of assets and ROIs? He thought of his grandfather, a carpenter, and his great-grandfather, as stonemason men who had built things with their hands, men who had died with little to their names but calluses and debt. He had always secretly feared it, that the artistic impulse, the need to create, was a genetic flaw, a curse that led to a life of quiet, noble obscurity. A life of failure. Tonight, that fear felt like a certainty. The city lights began to flicker on, a cold, indifferent constellation of 1,000 other lives, 1,000 other successes. He sat in the growing darkness, the beautiful, foolish drawings on his walls slowly dissolving into shadow, their hopeful lines and curves swallowed by the encroaching night. He was drowning, and the only life raft his father could offer was a soulless, corporate job that would be a quiet, comfortable death of the spirit. The phone buzzed again, a persistent, relentless reminder of the practical world he was failing to conquer. He ignored it, letting the darkness and the silence and the weight of his own profound, suffocating failure press in on him from all sides. Days bled into a gray, featureless smear. Leo existed in a state of suspended animation, moving between the uncomfortable sofa and the floor-to-ceiling windows of his glass cage. The city outside, once a symbol of ambition and possibility, was now just a cold, indifferent audience to his paralysis. He'd finally answered his father's call, a brief, mumbled conversation that had left him feeling even more hollowed out. The senior draftsman position at Henderson Group was his for the taking. A stable, practical, soulless future, gift wrapped in his father's disappointment. He hadn't said yes, but he hadn't said no either. He hadn't said anything at all. The mail arrived with a soft, metallic whisper, a thin stack of envelopes sliding through the slot in his door and onto the polished concrete floor. Bills. Junk mail. The mundane, relentless machinery of a life he no longer felt a part of. He ignored it for hours, letting the small white pile serve as another monument to his inertia. But as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, one envelope caught the last of the dying light. It was different from the others. The paper was thick, creamy, and expensive. The return address was a law firm he didn't recognize. He picked it up, the heavy, quality paper a strange, tactile intrusion into his desensitized world. He tore it open with a numb, detached curiosity. The language inside was as cold and sterile as the room around him. Legal jargon, clauses and subclauses, a forest of dense, black type. He scanned the document, his eyes catching on familiar words without absorbing their meaning. Asterisk, last will and testament, executor of the estate. And then, a name that stopped his breath in his throat, asterisk, Arthur Vance. His grandfather. A man he barely remembered, a ghost from a handful of awkward childhood holidays, a quiet, stooped figure who always smelled faintly of sawdust and turpentine. He hadn't seen him in 15 years. He hadn't even known he was sick. The letter informed him, in the most dispassionate terms possible, that his grandfather had passed away 2 weeks ago. And then came the line that made no sense, a bizarre, incomprehensible string of words that he had to read 3 times before they finally registered. Asterisk, hereby bequeaths to his sole heir, Leo Vance, the entirety of his remaining assets, to wit, 1. Freehold property, including all structures and contents therein, located at 714 Chestnut Road, Oak Haven, Ohio. Oak Haven. A forgotten, Rust Belt town somewhere in the middle of a state he'd only ever flown over. He didn't understand. His grandfather had owned property? A house? He'd always assumed the man had died as he'd lived a quiet, itinerant carpenter with nothing to his name. The letter continued, offering a final, clarifying detail that was even more baffling. Asterisk, the property in question consists of a 1.5-acre parcel of land, and a single, detached outbuilding, hereafter referred to as the workshop. Asterisk, not a house. A workshop. That was it. That was the sum total of his inheritance. A shed in the middle of nowhere. A fresh wave of the familiar, bitter disappointment washed over him. Of course. It was perfect. Another Vance man, another failed artist, leaving behind a legacy of splinters and dust. It wasn't a gift. It was a burden. Another mess for him to clean up, another piece of his family's legacy of noble failure that he would have to liquidate for pennies on the dollar to some local developer. Just like his own dreams. He dropped the letter on the counter, the thick paper landing with a soft, final thud. He felt a surge of bleak, almost comical despair. He was being offered a soulless corporate job on one hand, and had just inherited a pile of worthless, rotting wood on the other. His future, it seemed, was a choice between two different kinds of decay. He walked to the window and stared out at the glittering, indifferent city. The reflection that stared back was a stranger, a man in a rumpled suit, his eyes hollowed out by a failure he couldn't articulate. He was trapped. Paralyzed. Doomed to follow in the footsteps of a father who had traded his soul for stability, or a grandfather who had died with nothing but a shed to his name. But as he stood there, on the verge of surrendering completely, a tiny, unexpected flicker of something else ignited deep within the cold, dead ash of his ambition. A workshop. A place where things were made. A place where hands, not spreadsheets, determined the value of a thing. The thought was a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the tectonic plates of his despair. It was not hope. It was something far simpler and far more powerful. It was a mission. A single, concrete, practical task in a life that had become an abstract mess of failure. He had to go to Oakhaven. He had to see this place. He had to liquidate the past. And in that simple, brutal act of erasure, maybe, just maybe, he could finally escape it. He turned from the window, the city's cold, blue light at his back, and for the first time in days, he took a step. The drive from the city had been a slow, geographical unwinding. The blue glass towers had bled into sprawling suburbs, which in turn gave way to flat, featureless highways, and finally, to the cracked, two-lane blacktops of a part of the country that time had forgotten. Oakhaven announced itself not with a sign, but with a gradual accumulation of decay. Peeling paint on clapboard houses, rust-pocked pickup trucks, the skeletal remains of a factory with shattered windows staring out like vacant eyes. Leo's sleek, silver sedan, a testament to a life of leasing and liabilities, felt like a spaceship that had landed on a foreign planet. He found the address at the end of a gravel road, a road that seemed to simply give up and dissolve into a field of overgrown weeds. And there it was. The workshop. It was less a building and more a suggestion of one, a great, sagging structure of weathered, silver-grey wood that seemed to be held up by sheer force of memory. The roof was a patchwork of rust and moss, and the windows were opaque with the grime of 100 seasons. It was exactly the monument of failure he had expected. He killed the engine, the sudden silence of the countryside rushing in, a profound, almost unnerving quiet after the relentless hum of the city. He got out, the expensive leather of his city shoes crunching on the gravel. He was still wearing the clothes of his humiliation, a dark, slim-fit suit, now rumpled and out of place, a visual reminder of the man he was supposed to be. He looked at the workshop, his architect's eye clinically assessing the structural decay, the rot, the sheer hopelessness of it all. His plan was simple. Call a local junk removal service, get a realtor to list the lot for land value, and be back in his glass cage by the weekend. Liquidate the past. Move on. The massive, sliding barn door was secured by a heavy, rusted padlock that looked as old as the building itself. The key the lawyer had sent him was a simple, antique skeleton key. It scraped and fought the lock, a screech of metal on metal, before finally, with a groan of protest, the mechanism gave way. Leo put his shoulder to the door and shoved. It resisted, then shuddered, and began to slide open, its movement a low, mournful rumble that seemed to wake the ghosts inside. The first thing that hit him was the smell. It was a scent so thick, so rich, it was almost tangible. The dry, sweet perfume of cut pine and cedar, the sharp, metallic tang of oil, and underneath it all, the deep, earthy aroma of time itself. It was the smell of a place where things were made. He stepped inside, and the world transformed. The harsh, gray light of the overcast day was left behind, replaced by a warm, almost sacred glow. Sunlight, thick and golden, streamed in through the grime-caked windows high in the rafters, cutting through the dusty air in hazy, cathedral-like shafts. A universe of dust motes danced in the beams, a silent, swirling galaxy. The space was cavernous, cluttered, a chaotic landscape of half-finished projects, stacks of lumber, and strange, skeletal machinery draped in heavy canvas tarps like sleeping giants. His initial cynicism held firm. This was a hoarder's paradise, a lifetime of useless projects and forgotten junk. The liquidation would take longer than he thought. He ran a hand over a dusty workbench, leaving a clean streak in the thick, gray blanket of neglect. But as he moved deeper into the workshop, into the heart of the golden light, he saw something that made him pause. On one wall, hanging in a meticulously organized row, was a set of hand tools. They were not the cheap, plastic-handled tools of a weekend hobbyist. These were different. The chisels had hand-turned handles of dark, polished walnut, worn smooth and dark in the exact shape of a man's grip. The handsaws were brass and steel, their teeth still wickedly sharp. Each tool was a perfect marriage of form and function, an object of profound, utilitarian beauty. His cynicism began to fray at the edges. This was not the collection of a failed carpenter. This was the arsenal of a master craftsman. He was drawn to a large, central workbench, a massive slab of scarred and stained maple. Underneath a dusty tarp, he found not another pile of junk, but something else entirely. It was a half-finished object, an intricate, baffling assembly of polished brass gears, hand-carved wooden levers, and delicate, interlocking parts. It looked like a piece of an antique clock, or a strange, miniature orrery, but it served no purpose he could divine. It was a machine that did nothing but exist, a testament to the pure, obsessive joy of creation. It was, in its own strange way, a piece of art. He reached out, his fingers tracing the curve of a wooden gear, feeling the perfect, hands-ended smoothness of its teeth. This was the work of a man who spoke a language Leo had only ever dreamed of, a language of tangible, three-dimensional creation, a world away from the cold, soulless digital renderings of his own life. The plan to liquidate, to erase, to sell this history for scrap, suddenly felt like a profound act of sacrilege. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time, a deep, genuine curiosity cut through the heavy fog of his despair. He looked around the workshop, no longer seeing a pile of junk, but a hidden world, a secret life. And he realized, with a jolt that was both unsettling and strangely exhilarating, that he didn't know his grandfather at all. The plan to liquidate had dissolved like a phantom in the golden, dusty light. Days turned into a week, then two. Leo stopped calling realtors. He stopped thinking about the soulless job at Henderson Group. He had a new, singular obsession, the workshop. He shed the rumpled suit, his armor of a former life, and adopted a new uniform of worn jeans and a simple t-shirt, a uniform that was quickly christened with a fine, pale layer of sawdust. He was no longer a visitor. He was an archaeologist, excavating the ruins of a life he had never known. He worked with a methodical, almost feverish intensity. The initial, overwhelming chaos of the workshop began to resolve itself under his focused attention. He discovered that beneath the blanket of dust, there was a meticulous, almost fanatical, sense of order. Every tool had its place, every jar of screws was labeled in a neat, spidery script. This was not the space of a scatterbrained tinkerer. It was the sanctuary of a disciplined, obsessive mind. He found a stack of old accounting ledgers, and his heart sank, expecting a record of debt and failure. But the ledgers were filled not with numbers, but with sketches. Page after page of intricate, impossibly detailed drawings of mechanical objects. Clockwork birds, automated music boxes, strange, beautiful machines that served no logical purpose. His grandfather hadn't been trying to make a living. He had been trying to build a world. And then, he found the heart of the mystery. While cleaning the massive, maple workbench, His hand brushed against a section of the backsplash that felt loose. He pushed, and a small, perfectly concealed panel swung inward on a hidden hinge, revealing a dark, hollow cavity. Inside, stacked with irreverent care, were 3 leather-bound journals. They were heavy, their pages filled with the same neat, spidery script as the labels on the screw jars. He pulled out the first journal, its leather cover soft and supple with age. He expected to find more mechanical drawings, more schematics for impossible machines. He sat on a dusty stool, the golden afternoon light streaming in, and opened it. But the pages were not filled with gears and levers. They were filled with buildings. His breath caught in his throat. These were not the sketches of a carpenter. They were the drawings of a master architect. Page after page of breathtaking, visionary designs, unlike anything he had ever seen. Structures that curved and flowed with an organic grace, that seemed to grow out of the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. They were filled with light, with air, with a profound, humanistic joy. They were, in a word, beautiful. And they were brilliant. He was looking at the secret work of a genius. A man who had hidden his true passion away from the world, who had poured his soul onto these pages in the dusty solitude of this forgotten workshop. A profound, almost dizzying sense of connection washed over Leo. He was not just looking at drawings. He was looking at his own reflection, at the same dreams, the same passionate belief in the power of architecture to elevate the human spirit. The fear that he had inherited a legacy of failure was suddenly, violently, replaced by a shocking, exhilarating possibility. What if he had inherited a legacy of secret, unrecognized brilliance? He became a ghost, haunting the workshop, forgetting to eat, to sleep. The world outside, the world of missed calls from his father and mounting credit card debt, ceased to exist. His only reality was the journals. He deciphered the cryptic, handwritten notes, the complex technical drawings, the philosophical musings on the nature of light and space. He felt a kinship with this man he had never known, a shared language that transcended time. He was no longer just an archaeologist. He was a student, learning at the feet of a silent, invisible master. His phone, which he'd left to die in his car, was a relentless, nagging reminder of the world he was ignoring. His father's messages had gone from disappointed to angry. The Henderson Group job had been given to someone else. His landlord was threatening eviction. The practical, pragmatic world he had failed to conquer was closing in on him, its walls of responsibility slowly, inexorably, tightening. He ignored it all. The journals were more important. This connection was more important. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was a part of something real, something that mattered more than quarterly reports and projected ROIs. He reached the final pages of the last journal, a sense of profound, almost sorrowful finality settling over him. The last few pages were blank. He thought he had reached the end of the story, the end of his grandfather's secret life. But as he closed the back cover, his fingers brushed against something tucked into an inside pocket. It wasn't another drawing. It was a photograph. He slid the photograph from the journal's hidden pocket, his fingers trembling slightly. The paper was thick, its surface a landscape of fine cracks and silvered fades, a testament to a moment captured and held against the relentless tide of time. The image that emerged from the fog of a half-century was so clear, so vibrant, it felt less like a memory and more like a window. A young man, his great-grandfather, but not the stooped, silent figure Leo remembered. This was a man in his prime, his shoulders square, his dark hair swept back from a face that was handsome, proud, and lit with an expression of pure, unadulterated joy. He looked like a man who was standing at the very center of his own universe. And beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, was a woman. She was beautiful, with dark, intelligent eyes and a smile that seemed to echo the man's own joy. She was not his grandmother. Leo knew that with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty. He had seen photos of his grandmother as a young woman, and this was not her. This was a stranger, a ghost, a secret. But it was what stood behind them that made the air leave Leo's lungs in a single, silent rush. It was a building. But it was unlike any of the other brilliant, unbuilt dreams in the journals. This one was real. It was small, a single story, but it was a masterpiece of quiet, elegant design. It was built of pale, smooth stone and a warm, honey-colored wood, with a roof that curved upwards at the edges like a gentle, sheltering wing. A large, circular window dominated the front facade, a great, unblinking eye staring out at the world. It was a perfect jewel box of a building, a piece of architectural poetry made real. It was the kind of building Leo dreamed of designing. And his grandfather, the quiet, obscure carpenter, had actually built it. His obsession, which had been a slow, simmering fire, now roared to life, consuming everything. The debts, the eviction notice, his father's anger, it all burned away, leaving only this. This photograph. This mystery. He turned the picture over. On the back, in his grandfather's same, neat, spidery script, was a single, cryptic inscription. It was not a date or a location, but two lines that would change everything. Asterisk Maelia. Asterisk where I learned what it means to build. Asterisk Maelia. A woman's name? A place? The phrase was an enigma, a lock on a door he now had to open. The brilliant, visionary sketches in the journals were not a hobby. This photograph was the proof. This was not a secret passion, it was a secret life. The man who had hidden his genius away in this dusty workshop, the man who had abandoned this breathtaking talent to live a life of quiet, obscure carpentry, was a far greater mystery than Leo had ever imagined. The question was no longer who his grandfather was, but what had happened to him. What had happened to this brilliant, joyful man in the photograph? What had happened to this building? And who, in God's name, was Maelia? He stared at the photograph, at the two smiling faces, at the perfect jewel box of a building behind them. He saw the pride in his grandfather's eyes, the profound, unshakable confidence of a creator who had brought his vision to life. And in that moment, Leo felt a surge of something he hadn't felt since he'd stood before the development board, a feeling he thought had been permanently extinguished, a fierce, defiant hope. The story of the Vance men was not a simple, linear narrative of failure. It was a mystery. And this photograph, this beautiful, impossible photograph, was the first, tantalizing clue. He looked around the workshop, at the dusty, golden light, at the silent, sleeping tools, at the ghosts of 1,000 unfinished projects. This was not just a burden to be liquidated. It was an inheritance. But the inheritance wasn't the land, or the building, or the tools. It was this mystery, this story, and the sudden, unshakable conviction that he was the only person on earth who could uncover the truth. The workshop was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a command center in a war against time. The golden, dusty light of discovery had been replaced by the cold, blue-white glare of a laptop screen, a harsh, clinical glow that held the darkness at bay through the long, sleepless nights. The floor around Leo was a chaotic sea of paper. Printouts of old county maps, scribbled calculations, and page after page of his own frantic, obsessive sketches, attempts to reverse engineer a ghost from a single, faded photograph. He was a man possessed. The world outside had ceased to exist. His phone, long dead, was just a black, useless rectangle on the cluttered workbench. The eviction notice from his landlord and the stack of final demand letters were buried under a pile of historical survey documents. His only reality was the mystery of the photograph, the smiling man and woman, and the impossible, beautiful building that stood behind them. He had scanned the photo at an impossibly high resolution, a digital ghost of a physical object. He zoomed in, analyzing the grain of the wood, the tooling on the stone, the angle of the shadows, using the sun's position to calculate the time of day, the season, the building's orientation to the compass. His architectural software, once used to create soulless corporate assets, was now his only weapon. He took the cryptic technical drawings from his grandfather's journals, the precise angles of the roof joists, the load-bearing calculations for the circular window, and began to build. Not with wood and stone, but with polygons and light. Line by line, surface by surface, the building from the photograph began to emerge from the digital void, a three-dimensional ghost taking shape on his screen. He worked for days, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning, desperate need to see it, to understand it. Finally, he rendered the last texture, adjusted the last virtual light source, and leaned back. There it was. Perfect. A silent, digital resurrection. He could rotate it, zoom in, walk through its virtual doors. He had rebuilt his grandfather's masterpiece. But the question remained, where did it belong? Myelia. Where I learned what it means to build. The inscription was a taunt, a riddle. Was Myelia the woman? Or the place? He started with the woman's name, cross-referencing it with local census records from the 1950s and 60s. Nothing. He searched property deeds, looking for a parcel of land owned by anyone named Vance or Myelia. Dead ends. Frustration gnawed at him, a familiar, bitter taste of failure. He was close, so close, yet the final piece of the puzzle remained maddeningly out of reach. He slumped in his chair, staring at the perfect, virtual building on his screen. It was a masterpiece without a home, a story without a setting. His eyes were bleary from lack of sleep, the lines of code and architectural drawings blurring into a meaningless soup. And then he saw it. A tiny, insignificant detail in the background of the original photograph, something he'd dismissed 100 times. A partial, blurry image of a road sign. He ran a dozen enhancement filters, sharpening the pixels, pulling a ghostly, half-formed word from the digital noise. Mill Creek. His heart hammered against his ribs. Mill Creek. He frantically cross-referenced the name with the old county maps. And there it was. A small, unincorporated township just outside Oakhaven, a place that had been absorbed into the county 50 years ago. And on a detailed survey map from 1958, he found it. A small, oddly shaped parcel of land, right next to a place labeled Mill Creek Falls. The plot was designated not with a number, but with a name. The Myelia Project. A choked, triumphant laugh escaped his lips. He had it. He had found it. The surge of victory was a physical thing, a jolt of adrenaline that left him dizzy. He now had a location, a concrete place in the world. The mystery was finally cracking open. With trembling fingers, he typed the coordinates and the project name into a search engine, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it still there? Was it a ruin? Who owned it now? The search results were sparse. A few genealogical records, a link to the county surveyor's office. And then, a single, top result from a digitized local newspaper archive. The Oakhaven Chronicle. The date was October 12, 1968. The headline was a punch to the gut, a string of words that made the world tilt on its axis. Beloved Mill Creek Library lost in midnight blaze. He clicked the link, his blood turning to ice. A grainy, black and white photo showed the smoldering, skeletal ruins of a building. The curved roofline, the great, circular hole where the beautiful window had been, it was unmistakable. His beautiful, perfect building, reduced to a pile of charred timbers and blackened stone. He forced himself to read the article, his eyes scanning the text, the words blurring through a sudden, hot film of tears. It described the building as a unique and beloved community treasure, a free library built by an anonymous benefactor. And then came the final sentence, the two words that were the final, brutal twist of the knife, the two words that erased his grandfather's legacy from the face of the earth. Asterisk, architect unknown. Asterisk, the laptop screen glowed, a cold, indifferent tombstone in the suffocating darkness of the workshop. Architect unknown. The words were a brand, a final, anonymous erasure of a brilliant life. The triumph of discovery, the exhilarating rush of connection Leo had felt, had curdled into a thick, black poison in his gut. It wasn't just that the building was gone. It was that it had never, officially, existed. His grandfather's masterpiece had been a ghost, and now, even its memory had been paved over by the relentless, uncaring march of time. He felt a desperate, clawing need to know more, to understand how this could have happened. He fumbled for the journals, his hands clumsy, his mind reeling. He tore through the pages, no longer a careful archaeologist, but a frantic scavenger, searching for an answer, a reason, a final piece of the puzzle. He found it on the very last page of the final journal, a page he had missed in his initial, awestruck reading. It wasn't a sketch. It was an entry, a single, dense block of text, the neat, spidery script now a jagged, almost illegible scrawl, the ink blurred and watered down in places, as if by tears. The date at the top of the page was October 13, 1968, the day after the fire. And the words that followed were not the philosophical musings of a master builder, but the raw, bleeding confession of a broken man. Asterisk. He burned it. Asterisk. The entry began, the words a raw, open wound on the page. Asterisk. Henderson. That smiling, backslapping son of a bitch. He came to me with a deal. A partnership. Said the town council loved the library, wanted to fund a whole new civic center based on my designs. All I had to do was sign the land over to his development company. For the good of the project, he said. Leo's blood ran cold. Henderson. The name of the soulless, corporate firm his father wanted him to work for. The name was a curse, a generational plague. Asterisk. I was a fool. Asterisk. The journal continued. Asterisk. A naive, trusting fool. I signed. And the next night, my library, our library, Myelia's library, was ash. The fire was ruled an accident. Faulty wiring. And Henderson used the insurance money, and the land I had so stupidly signed over to him, to build a strip mall. A concrete box. An asset. The word hit Leo like a physical blow. Asset. The same word Sterling had used. The same cold, dead, pragmatic word that had been used to shatter his own dream. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a pattern. A curse. Asterisk. He didn't just burn the wood and the stone. Asterisk. His grandfather wrote, the last lines a ragged, desperate whisper. Asterisk. He burned the idea. He burned the joy. He showed me what the world truly values. And I am done. I will never build again. I will never dream again. Myelia, my love, forgive me. I have failed you. Asterisk. That was it. The end of the story. The end of the brilliant, joyful man in the photograph. The betrayal had not just destroyed a building, it had shattered a soul. His grandfather hadn't chosen a life of quiet, obscure carpentry. He had been sentenced to it. His genius had been murdered, and he had spent the next 50 years burying the body. Leo closed the journal, the soft thud of the leather cover a sound of profound finality. He felt a dizzying, terrifying sense of vertigo, as if he were looking at his own life through a distorted, 50-year-old lens. The humiliation in the boardroom, his father's relentless pragmatism, the crushing weight of his own self-doubt, it was all an echo. A generational reverberation of the same brutal story. The idealist, the artist, the dreamer, crushed by the cold, hard, profitable machinery of the world. He was his grandfather. He was doomed to repeat the same tragic, forgotten history. He stood, his movements stiff, mechanical. The workshop, which had felt like a sanctuary of hope, a place of connection, now felt like a tomb. It was a monument to a broken dream, a mausoleum for a murdered talent. And he was its sole, cursed inheritor. He looked at the beautiful, handmade tools, the intricate, half-finished projects, the brilliant, visionary drawings, and he saw not genius, but a profound, heartbreaking tragedy. What was the point of creating beautiful things in a world that only valued assets? What was the point of dreaming, when the world was run by men with blowtorches and spreadsheets? He had to get out. He couldn't breathe. The air, once thick with the sweet perfume of creation, now felt choked with the ash of his grandfather's failure, and his own. He walked to the massive sliding door and shoved it open, stumbling out into the cold, indifferent night. The plan was no longer to liquidate the past. The plan was to run from it. To sell this cursed land, to take the soulless, practical job at Henderson Group, to kill the artist inside himself before the world did it for him. He would not be his grandfather. He would not spend 50 years in a dusty tomb, mourning a dream the world had decided was unprofitable. He would be practical. He would be an asset. He would be nothing. The decision was made. A cold, hard certainty that settled in the pit of his stomach like a stone. He would call the realtor in the morning. He would take the job at Henderson, a final, bitter irony, joining the very firm that had destroyed his grandfather. He would become the thing he despised. It was a form of suicide, a slow, methodical erasure of the dreamer, the artist, the part of him that was still naive enough to believe that beauty had a place in the world. It was the only way to survive. He walked back into the workshop, the air still thick with the ghost of his grandfather's failure. But this time, he was not an archaeologist. He was an undertaker. He found a stack of old cardboard boxes and began the grim, joyless task of packing. He started with the tools, the beautiful, handmade instruments of a dead art. He picked up a chisel, its walnut handle worn smooth and dark with a lifetime of use. He ran his thumb over the cool, sharp steel. This was not just a tool. It was a piece of a man's soul. And he was packing it away to be sold for scrap. The sacrilege of it was a physical weight, a sickness in his throat. He worked with a numb, mechanical efficiency, a man dismantling a life. His own and his grandfather's. The tools went into one box. The half-finished mechanical curiosities into another. The journals, the leather-bound records of a secret genius, he placed in a third, sealing the lid with a brutal finality. He was burying the evidence. He was burying the past. He was burying himself. He was down to the last box, the last of the tools from the meticulously organized wall. He knelt on the dusty, uneven floorboards, the single, bare bulb high in the rafters casting a harsh, lonely light. He reached for the last, heavy mallet, his fingers brushing against the rough, splintered wood of the floor. And then his hand stopped. One of the floorboards was loose. It shifted slightly under the pressure of his hand, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. But in the profound, dead quiet of the workshop, the faint, dry creak of the wood was as loud as a gunshot. He paused, his undertaker's work forgotten. He pushed on the board again, deliberately this time. It moved, a soft, yielding give that was different from the solid, unmoving boards around it. This was not the random decay of time. This was intentional. He felt along the edge of the board, his fingers tracing a clean, straight line that had been cut with a saw, not rotted by damp. A trapdoor. But not a trapdoor. Something smaller. A hiding place. His heart, which he thought had been permanently numbed, began to beat a slow, heavy drum. He found a small, almost invisible notch at one end of the board. He hooked his fingers into it and pulled. The board lifted away, revealing not a dark, empty space, but the edge of something else. Something made of wood, but a different kind of wood. Dark, rich, and intricately carved. He set the floorboard aside and reached into the shallow cavity. He pulled out a box. It was not the rusted, utilitarian metal box that had held the journals. This was a work of art. It was made of a deep, red mahogany, its surface covered in a complex, flowing pattern of carved leaves and vines. It was the work of a master craftsman, a man who loved the wood, who understood its language. And it was too beautiful, too deliberate, to be a piece of forgotten junk. It had not been stored here. It had been hidden. It had been preserved. There was no lock, only a small, perfectly fitted lid. He lifted it. The inside was lined with a deep, blue velvet, faded but still rich. And nestled within the velvet, like the holy relics of a forgotten religion, was a pristine, untouched set of custom-made drafting tools. A gleaming silver compass. A set of perfectly calibrated rulers made of ivory and brass. A row of pens with delicate, sharp nibs. This was not a carpenter's toolkit. This was an architect's arsenal. But these were not his grandfather's working tools. These were a gift. A symbol. Something to be passed down. And then he saw it. Tucked into a small, velvet sleeve at the side of the box. A single, sealed envelope. The paper was thick, creamy, the same expensive stock as the lawyer's letter. But this was not from a lawyer. On the front, in his grandfather's neat, spidery script, was a single word, Leo. He stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. It was impossible. His grandfather had been dead for weeks. He hadn't seen him in 15 years. But this letter, this box, it had been waiting. Waiting for him. He picked up the envelope. It was heavy, sealed with a small, perfect circle of dark blue wax. A faint, impossible question hung in the dusty, silent air. A question that was not about the past, but about the future. A question that was not an ending, but a beginning. He sat on the dusty floor, the beautifully carved mahogany box open before him, the pristine drafting tools gleaming in the single, stark shaft of light from the bare bulb overhead. The cardboard boxes, filled with the packed-away relics of a surrendered dream, sat in the shadows around him, a silent, accusing jury. The sealed envelope, addressed to him in his grandfather's familiar, spidery script, felt impossibly heavy in his hands. It was a message from a ghost, a final, unexpected variable in an equation he thought he had already solved. His first impulse was to put it back. To close the box, replace the floorboard, and continue with the grim, joyless task of erasure. The story was over. It had ended in ash and betrayal 50 years ago, and its tragic echo had ended for him in a cold, blue-glass boardroom a few weeks ago. There was nothing left to say. But his fingers wouldn't obey. The wax seal, a perfect, dark blue circle, held his gaze. It was not a barrier. It was an invitation. A final, silent question. With a trembling thumb, he broke the seal. The sound, a soft, dry crackle, was unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the workshop. He unfolded the single, heavy sheet of paper. The letter was not long. But the words on the page were not the final, tear-stained confession of a broken man. They were the words of a philosopher. They were the words of a teacher. Leo. It began, the name a shock, a direct, personal address across the void. If you are reading this, it means you have found my tomb, but you have also found my heart. Do not mourn the man who spent his last 50 years in this workshop. He was a ghost, haunted by a world that values spreadsheets over soul. The man I was, the man I hope you are, died with his library. Leo's breath hitched. This was not a letter of apology. It was a manifesto. Asterisk, I know the story you have uncovered. A story of failure. A story of a beautiful thing that was turned to ash by a man who saw only its monetary value. And I know you, my boy. I have watched you from afar. I have seen the same fire in your eyes, the same dangerous, beautiful, unprofitable dreams. And I know you are afraid. You are afraid that you have inherited my curse. The curse of the artist in a world of assets. He felt the words like a physical touch, a ghostly hand on his shoulder. His grandfather had seen him. He had understood. Asterisk, but you are wrong. Asterisk, the letter continued, the script growing stronger, more forceful. Asterisk, that is not your inheritance. This is. Asterisk, Leo's eyes flickered to the pristine, untouched drafting tools in the box. Asterisk, that fire was the greatest lesson of my life. Henderson, and men like him, they have a terrible power. They can burn the wood and the stone. They can tear down the walls. They can erase a thing from the face of the earth. But they cannot burn the idea. They cannot touch the dream. An idea, a dream, a truly beautiful design, it is indestructible. It will always exist, waiting for a new set of hands to give it form. The cold, dead despair that had settled in Leo's soul began to recede, replaced by a tiny, fragile spark of something he had not felt in a very, very long time. A flicker of defiance. Asterisk, this workshop is not a tomb, Leo. It is an arsenal. These tools are not relics. They are weapons. And this is not a curse. It is a legacy. But a legacy is not what you leave behind. It is what you leave within. I have left within you the fire, the dream, the dangerous, beautiful, unprofitable idea that architecture is not about building assets, but about elevating the human spirit. That is your inheritance. Do not let them extinguish it. Do not let them win. And then the final, simple line. Asterisk, your grandfather, Arthur. He folded the letter, his hands no longer trembling. The silence of the workshop was different now. It was no longer the dead, suffocating silence of a tomb. It was a charged, expectant silence, pregnant with possibility. The golden light that had once felt tragic now felt like a benediction. He looked at the box of pristine drafting tools, then at the cardboard boxes filled with his grandfather's worn, well-used instruments. He saw it now. The old tools were the tools of a man who had built a thing. The new tools were a gift to the man who would build the idea. He stood, his body no longer slumped with the weight of a generational curse. The decision to surrender, to take the soulless job, to become an asset, felt like it had been made by a different man, a weaker man, a stranger. He walked over to the cardboard box marked Journals and broke the seal. He took out the faded photograph of the smiling man and woman, of the beautiful, impossible library that had been turned to ash. He looked at his grandfather's joyful, defiant face. And for the first time, he did not see a failure. He saw a soldier who had lost a battle, but who had, in his final act, passed the torch in a much longer war. He, Leo Vance, was the new set of hands. And the idea was waiting. The cold, blue glow of the laptop was gone, banished from the workshop. In its place, a single, warm lamp cast a pool of golden light onto a massive, scarred drafting table that Leo had dragged into the center of the room. The air, thick with the scent of old wood and new beginnings, was silent save for the soft, rhythmic whisper of graphite on paper. This was not the sterile, silent hum of a digital workspace. This was the quiet, sacred sound of creation. Leo worked with a feverish, joyful intensity he hadn't felt in years. The pristine, ivory and brass drafting tools from his grandfather's hidden box felt like extensions of his own hand, instruments of a forgotten magic. The cardboard boxes of his aborted escape lay open and discarded, their contents now spread across the workbench not as relics to be liquidated, but as an arsenal to be wielded. The journals were open. The faded photograph of the Myelia library was pinned to a wooden beam above the table, a silent, smiling ghost offering its benediction. He had taken the renderings of his failed project, the hemlock, and pinned them to the rough-hewn wall of the workshop. In the harsh light of the boardroom, they had been his pride. Here, in the warm, honest glow of his inheritance, they looked sterile, timid, apologetic. They were the work of a man trying to please a committee, a soulless compromise between his own vision and the crushing pragmatism of the corporate world. He saw them now for what they were, an asset, not artwork. And he was done building assets. He did not tear them down. He began to transform them. With a piece of charcoal, he started sketching directly onto a fresh sheet of vellum laid over the old plans, his hand moving with a newfound confidence. The rigid, profitable grid of the original design began to dissolve. He channeled the spirit of the journals, the ghost of his grandfather's genius. The central courtyard, once a simple, cost-effective rectangle of green, began to curve and flow, its shape echoing the gentle, organic lines of the Myelia library. The sterile, glass-box community center at its heart was erased, and in its place, a new structure began to emerge. A small, jewel box of a building with a soaring, curved roof and a great, circular window that would flood the space with morning light. It was an homage, a resurrection, a defiant shout across 50 years of silence. He was no longer just designing a building. He was weaving a story into its very foundations. The wood would be locally sourced oak, the stone would be from a nearby quarry materials with a history, a soul. The walkways would not be linear and efficient, but would meander, encouraging residents to slow down, to interact, to become a community, not just a collection of units. He was embedding his grandfather's philosophy, the indestructible idea, into every line, every angle, every choice. He was taking the pain of his own humiliation and the tragedy of his grandfather's betrayal, and he was transforming it, alchemizing it into a thing of beauty and defiance. He worked for days, losing all track of time, the rhythms of the world outside fading into an irrelevant hum. This was his true inheritance, not the dusty workshop, but this reawakened fire, this profound, unshakable sense of purpose. He was not seeking revenge against Henderson or Sterling. Revenge was their language, a currency of power and domination. His response would be to create something so full of life, so full of heart, so full of history, that it would make their soulless, glass and steel assets look like the tombs they truly were. Finally, it was done. He had a new set of blueprints, hand-drawn, filled with passionate, scribbled notes and beautiful, soulful details. He had not just redesigned a project, he had given it a new name. He called it the Myelia Project. A continuation. A completion. A promise kept. He rolled the blueprints carefully, securing them not in a cold, plastic tube, but in a simple, hand-stitched leather satchel he had found amongst his grandfather's things. He did not send it to his old firm. He did not send it to any corporate developer. He spent an entire morning researching, and found a small, independent architectural foundation based in Portland, a group whose mission statement was not about profit, but about vision. Their submission guidelines asked for projects that tell a story, that honor a history, that serve a community. He stood by the workshop's open door, the morning sun warm on his face, the heavy, leather satchel in his hand. This was not the desperate, pleading act of a young architect seeking validation. This was a quiet, confident offering. It was an act of faith. He had no idea if these people, this foundation, would understand what he had done. But for the first time in his life, it didn't matter. He looked at the beautiful, flawed, heartfelt drawings, the physical manifestation of his own reawakened soul, and he knew, with a certainty that was as solid and real as the old tools in the workshop, that he had already won. The room was not a boardroom. It was a library, in a repurposed brick warehouse, with afternoon light the color of honey streaming through tall, arched windows. The air smelled of old paper and roasted coffee. The judges, 5 of them, sat not at a long, intimidating table, but in a comfortable semicircle of worn leather armchairs. They were architects, artists, and community leaders, their faces etched with the kind of thoughtful intelligence that cannot be bought. Leo stood before them. He was not the boy in the too-tight suit. He wore a simple, dark t-shirt and the same sawdust christened jeans he'd worn for weeks in the workshop. He was not here to impress. He was here to testify. On a small table beside him, he had not a laptop, but a collection of relics. His grandfather's final, heartbreaking journal, the faded photograph of the Myelia library, and a single, heavy, walnut-handled chisel, its steel edge still gleaming. He did not begin with renderings or projections. He began with a story. His voice, quiet but steady, filled the warm, silent room. A few months ago, he started, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. I stood in a room much colder than this one, and I presented a building. It was a good building. It was efficient, sustainable, and practical. And it was dismissed in under a minute because, as the CEO told me, they build assets, not artwork. He let the words hang in the air, a shared memory of a familiar, soul-crushing pragmatism. He then picked up the faded photograph. This was my grandfather, he said, his voice softening. And this was his library. It was not an asset. It was a gift. A piece of architectural poetry he built with his own hands, for a woman he loved, in a town that needed it. It was, for a short time, the most beautiful thing in the world. He told them everything. The story of the dusty workshop, a place he had inherited as a burden and discovered as a sanctuary. The story of the brilliant, visionary journals, a secret life hidden from a world that had no language for it. He told them about the fire, the betrayal, and the 50 years of silence that followed. He held up the chisel. This was one of his tools. He was a master craftsman who the world convinced to become a simple carpenter. He was an artist who was told his work had no value. He paused, the weight of his family's history, and his own, settling in the quiet room. I came to that workshop believing I had inherited a legacy of failure. That the artistic impulse, the need to create things with soul, was a genetic curse that led to obscurity. I was ready to give up. To take the practical job. To start building assets. Then, he unrolled his blueprints. They were not the slick, lifeless digital prints of his first presentation. These were hand-drawn on thick, creamy vellum, the lines filled with a passionate, human imperfection. The whisper of the paper was the only sound in the room. He did not point out the specs or the square footage. He pointed to the heart of the design. This is not the Hemlock Project anymore, he said, his finger tracing the elegant, curved lines of the central building. This is the Myelia Project. Its design is an echo of a building that was turned to ash 50 years ago. Because my grandfather taught me, in a letter he left for me to find, that you can burn the wood and the stone, but you cannot burn the idea. He explained how the building was more than a structure, it was a story. How the materials were chosen for their history, how the walkways were designed for human connection, how the light was channeled to create a sense of hope. He was not just an architect presenting a design, he was a curator presenting a legacy. He was the voice for a man who had lost his own. When he finished, a profound, unbroken silence filled the library. The 5 judges were not looking at the blueprints. They were looking at him. Their faces were not impassive or judgmental. They were moved. They were captivated, not by the rendering of a building, but by the raw, emotional truth of a story well and truly told. They saw not just a brilliant design, but the soul behind it. The camera pushes in, slowly, on Leo's face. He has laid his inheritance, his pain, and his reawakened hope bare for them to see. The tired, haunted look in his eyes is gone, replaced by a calm, quiet fire. He is no longer the dismissed, humiliated boy seeking validation from a world he despises. He is a confident, purposeful architect, a man who has finally found the true measure of his own work. The Foundation's decision, whatever it may be, is suddenly, beautifully, irrelevant. In his own heart, in the quiet, dusty workshop of his own soul, he has already been vindicated. The seasons had turned. The harsh, biting winds of a long, lonely winter had given way to the soft, tentative warmth of spring. The workshop, once a tomb of dust and decay, was now a place of gentle, purposeful life. The gaping wounds in the roof had been healed, and now the afternoon sun, a benevolent, hazy gold, streamed through the newly glazed windows, illuminating a space that was not cluttered, but full, not chaotic, but alive. Leo was at the great, scarred workbench, a pair of his grandfather's old wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. He was not designing a skyscraper. He was not drafting a community. He was doing something small, something quiet. With a delicate, razor-sharp chisel, he was carefully cleaning the rust from the intricate brass gears of the strange, beautiful, useless machine his grandfather had left half-finished. He worked with a slow, meditative focus, his hands, no longer soft and pale from a life lived at a keyboard, but calloused and capable, moving with a newfound, confident grace. The air was thick with the scent of lemon oil and sawdust, the only sound the soft, rhythmic scrape of steel on brass. A car door closed, a soft, distant thud that was just loud enough to break the spell. Leo looked up, squinting into the bright afternoon light that framed the massive, open doorway. A woman stood there, a silhouette against the sun. She was elderly, elegant, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, a long, cashmere scarf draped over the shoulders of her simple, well-tailored coat. She did not enter, but simply stood at the threshold, her eyes, sharp and intelligent, taking in the scene. The neatly organized tools on the wall, the stacks of fresh-cut lumber, the young man at the workbench who looked so perfectly, so naturally, at home. Arthur would have liked this, she said, her voice a quiet, melodic thing that carried easily in the still air. He always said a workshop was a living thing. That it would die if you didn't give it a reason to breathe. Leo set the chisel down, a faint, welcoming smile touching his lips. He recognized her. She had been the woman at the center of the panel, the head of the architectural foundation. The one whose eyes had seemed to understand the story before he had even finished telling it. "I'm just trying to keep it alive," he said, his voice quiet, easy. She stepped inside, her movements as graceful and deliberate as his own had become. She ran a hand along the smooth, oiled surface of a newly restored table saw. "You've done more than that," she said. "You've resurrected it." She looked at him, her gaze direct, kind. "I was one of the judges for the foundation. Your presentation. It was the most honest piece of architecture I have seen in 30 years. "Thank you," Leo said, a simple, heartfelt gratitude that was a world away from the desperate need for validation he had once felt. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, leather-bound photograph frame. She held it out to him. It was a picture of a young woman, the same beautiful, dark-eyed woman from his grandfather's photograph. But this photo was different. It was a formal portrait, and the woman's smile was not the joyful, carefree smile of the workshop photo, but something softer, more knowing, a quiet, inner luminescence. "I wanted you to see her as I remember her," the elderly woman said, her voice thick with a sudden, profound emotion. "This was my mother." Leo stared at the photograph, then at the woman before him, the impossible, beautiful truth of it all dawning on him. "Your mother," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Her name was Myelia," she said, her smile now a mirror of her mother's, a sad, beautiful, knowing thing. "And Arthur Vance was the great, secret love of her life." She began to speak, and the last, missing pieces of his grandfather's story clicked into place, not with the violent, tragic force of a curse, but with the gentle, quiet grace of a love story. She told him of her mother, a librarian with a fierce, quiet passion for stories and a belief in the defiant power of beauty. She told him of Arthur, the brilliant, gentle dreamer who would visit her library, not to read the books, but to sketch the way the light fell through its tall, arched windows. She spoke of their shared dream: to build a new kind of library, a small, perfect sanctuary of light and wood and stories, a gift to a town that had forgotten how to dream. "That fire," she said, her voice dropping, the memory a palpable shadow in the golden room. "It did break him, as a builder. But it did not break their love. He retreated into this workshop, and she retreated into her books. But they never truly left each other. He built her beautiful, impossible things, clockwork birds that sang, music boxes that played her favorite sonatas. And she read to him. Every week, for 40 years, she would come here and sit on that stool right there, and she would read him stories of other worlds, of brave heroes and impossible dreams. He had stopped building for the world, you see. So she brought the world to him." Leo looked at the stool, at the faded photograph pinned to the beam, and the workshop transformed again. It was not a tomb. It was not a sanctuary. It was a temple, built for one, where a quiet, 50-year act of love and artistic defiance had been the only form of worship. He had thought he'd inherited a tragedy. He realized now, with a clarity that was as bright and warm as the sun streaming through the windows, that he had inherited a love story. The Foundation's grant was a generous one, a validation of his vision, a tangible reward for his defiance. His father had called, his voice a strange, unfamiliar mix of pride and confusion, having read about the award in a trade publication. The world Leo had once so desperately sought to conquer was now, ironically, knocking at his door. They wanted to fund the Myelia Project, his grand, community-centric housing complex. They wanted to build his story. But Leo knew, with a certainty that was as calm and clear as the spring morning, that he had a different story to finish first. He did not cash the check. He did not hire a crew. Instead, he returned to the journals. But this time, he was not searching for the ghost of the library. He was searching for the heart of the love story. And he found it, tucked into the final pages, a small, unassuming addendum he had overlooked in his frantic search for the grander mystery. It was a complete set of architectural drawings, not for a public building, but for a private home. A small, perfect house, with the same elegant, curving roofline as the library, the same thoughtful use of light and wood. At the top of the first page, in his grandfather's neat, spidery script, was the title, for Myelia. A place to come home to. It was the home Arthur had designed for her, the one he had dreamed of building on the small plot of land next to the workshop, a home he had abandoned after the fire, after the joy of building had been stolen from him. It was the final, unbuilt chapter of their story. And so, Leo began to build. Not with a crew of contractors, not with cranes and heavy machinery, but with his own 2 hands. He cleared the small, overgrown meadow beside the workshop, a place where the morning sun fell in a perfect, golden sheet. He laid the foundation with a quiet, reverent precision, his movements a slow, deliberate dance. And then, he opened his grandfather's old wooden toolbox, and he began to raise the walls. This was a different kind of architecture. It had no budget, no client, no deadline. It was not a performance for a board of directors or a desperate plea for validation. It was a conversation. It was a prayer. Each time he picked up one of the walnut-handled chisels, he could feel the faint, ghostly impression of his grandfather's grip. The rhythmic rasp of the handplane against a fresh-cut cedar beam was a form of communication, a shared language that transcended the silence of the grave. He was no longer just an architect who created images on a screen. He was a builder, a craftsman, a direct descendant in a long, unbroken line of men who knew how to make things that were real. The process was slow, painstaking, and deeply healing. The splinters in his hands were a welcome penance. The ache in his back was a grounding force. The fine, pale dust of the wood that settled in his hair and clothes was a kind of benediction. He was not just building a house, he was reconstructing himself. With every perfectly set joist, he was mending a piece of his own fractured foundation. With every pane of glass he set into a window frame, he was letting the light back into the dark, shuttered rooms of his own soul. He was finishing his grandfather's last, most important sentence. He was completing a promise that had been left to hang in the air for half a century. The small house grew, slowly, organically, from the earth. The soaring, curved roofline, once a dream on a page, reached for the sky. The great, circular window, an echo of the one that had been lost to the flames, was set in the western wall, perfectly positioned to capture the last, most brilliant colors of the setting sun. It was Arthur's vision, his genius, but it was being brought to life by Leo's hands, his sweat, his reawakened heart. The generational curse, the fear of the artist's tragic, unprofitable end, was being dismantled, timber by timber, nail by nail. He stood back as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the house bathed in a warm, honey-colored glow. It was small. It was simple. It would never win any awards or be featured in any magazines. But it was the most beautiful, the most honest, the most important thing he had ever built. It was not an asset. It was a sanctuary. And in building it, he had finally, truly, found his own. The sun was a molten gold, pouring its last, most brilliant light across the small, quiet meadow. It was a light that didn't just illuminate, it sanctified. It caught the warm, honey-colored grain of the cedar siding on the small house, making it glow from within. It streamed through the great, circular window, a perfect, unblinking eye, and set the dust motes dancing in the silent rooms inside. The air was cool and still, carrying the sweet, earthy scent of freshly turned soil and the distant, clean perfume of pine from the surrounding woods. Leo sat on the porch steps, the wood still warm from the day's sun. He had laid these boards himself, his own hands sanding them smooth, his own hammer driving the nails home. He leaned back against a post he had raised, feeling the solid, reassuring reality of the thing he had built. He was not the man who had arrived here months ago, a ghost in a rumpled suit, his eyes hollowed out by a world that had no language for his dreams. The slightly too tight armor of his corporate life was a distant, almost comical memory. He wore a simple, faded t-shirt and jeans stained with wood sap and honest dirt. The tired, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a profound, settled calm. He was no longer a visitor here. He was home. In his hands, he held the faded photograph. It was no longer a clue, a mystery to be solved. It was a family portrait. He looked at the faces of the two young, joyful people, at the ghost of the beautiful, impossible building that had once stood behind them. He saw his grandfather, not as the silent, stooped figure from his childhood, nor as the broken man from the final journal entry, but as he was in this one, perfect, captured moment. A brilliant creator, standing at the very center of his own universe, his face lit with the pure, unadulterated joy of having made a beautiful thing. And beside him, Myelia, her smile a quiet, knowing testament to a love that had outlasted fire and betrayal and 50 years of silence. He lifted his gaze from the past in his hands and looked at the present before him. He looked at the house. His house. Arthur's house. Their house. The elegant, curved roofline, a sheltering wing against the darkening sky. The warm, welcoming glow of the light from within. The perfect, circular window, which now reflected the fiery, brilliant colors of the sunset. He had done it. He had taken the indestructible idea, the dream that had been turned to ash, and he had given it a new form. He had built the final, unwritten chapter of their love story. He had taken his inheritance, the fire, the pain, the dangerous, unprofitable dream, and he had made it real. He thought of the city, of the cold, blue glass towers that scraped the sky, of the boardrooms where men with spreadsheets decided the value of a thing. It felt like another lifetime, a foreign country he had visited long ago. He had once so desperately craved their validation, their acknowledgement that he, and his work, had meaning. He realized now, with a clarity as pure and simple as the evening air, that he had been looking for meaning in the wrong place all along. True validation was not something that could be given to you by a committee. It was something you built, with your own 2 hands. It was the quiet, unshakable peace that came from making a beautiful thing in a world that too often settled for less. A single, quiet smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of triumph or of victory. It was a smile of profound, quiet, and complete contentment. He had not redeemed his grandfather's legacy, he had completed it. He had not conquered the world, he had found his small, perfect place within it. And in doing so, he had finally, truly, redeemed himself. The camera begins to pull back, slowly, gently. Leo remains on the porch, a small, still figure in the vast, beautiful landscape. The new house, and the old, weathered workshop beside it, stand together, a testament to a story that has finally been told. The setting sun casts a final, breathtaking golden light over the entire scene, before dipping below the horizon, leaving the world in a soft, peaceful twilight. The first stars begin to appear in the deep, velvet sky. He is a creator, sitting on the porch of his own creation, finally at peace. The generational curse is broken. The inheritance has been claimed. He is home. What family secret would change everything for you? Share your thoughts below.